I'm Jonathan Head on the board of the FCCT, and thanks a lot to everybody who has come. Look, should be a really interesting night. It's a chance to look at an extraordinary, I was going to say an extraordinary murder. Of course, we've had two extraordinary murders take place in this region just in the last month, but the murder of Ko Ni is particularly chilling because of what it might say about the state of power and accountability in today's Myanmar. Just to let you know about events coming up, next week we have, I don't know how many of you have been coming to our documentary season. We've got an absolutely cracking series of documentaries running every Monday. We've lined up a whole series for this first season. They're the kind of films you just won't see anywhere else. They're really, really interesting. We've had a great attendance. You'll get another chance next Monday to see the remarkable Indonesian film, The Look of Silence, looking at the killings in 1965 through the eyes of those in Indonesia, when we had more than 500,000 people killed in anti-communist pogroms. And it's a film made looking at the killings through the eyes of those who carried them out, as well as those who were victims. It's a very, very powerful film, and it's definitely what some of you will have seen it already. We've shown it in the past in the club, but if you haven't, do come along. We were planning to have an event on corruption next Wednesday, but we are struggling a little bit to find anybody to come and talk about it. You'd think it'd be something. And we've been through the gamut of a whole range of officials and unofficial sources. It's a little tricky, so that one's hanging in the balance right now. But on the 15th, we've got a very interesting program. We're going to bring some students down from Isan, from Ubon Ratchathani, who've been out doing field work, research in rural communities, looking at collective memory there, and also the local view of how their lives have developed recently under the military as well. It'll be very much a student eye view. We're going to structure it so that you'll get a very strong idea of what these students have learned. And we don't feel we get here enough from the grassroots out in Isan. We don't get speakers here very often. So we hope that that's quite a refreshing change for you, and hope that you'll come along for that. Let's get going with tonight's panel. I'm going to ask my speakers, if they've finished their drinks and dinner, if they could come and take their places behind their name tags. But as they make their way up, we don't really know yet what lay behind the killing of this very important figure in the National League for Democracy in Myanmar, Ko Ni. He was, of course, working on revisions to the constitution, which is a very sensitive issue. He's a Muslim, that's another sensitive issue. The government has ascribed the motives of the killers who've been caught as extreme patriotism, is the way they put it, a rather odd explanation. So there's not a great deal of confidence at this stage that the official investigation is going to reveal what really went on. And that's why we brought quite a range of people to talk to you tonight. I'm very pleased. Over on the right there we have Myo Win of the Smile Education and Development Foundation. And Myo, I think you actually knew Ko Ni quite well, and we're hoping to hear a bit about him. He's quite a remarkable man from somebody who knew him very well. You'll recognise Phil Robertson sitting down next to him from Human Rights Watch. Obviously have a very strong view on how the investigation is proceeding and what it represents in Myanmar. We're very glad to see Larry Jagan back here. Anybody whoever follows Myanmar will know Larry's name. In fact, he's been following Myanmar longer than many of us have been alive. I'm not speaking of myself, of course, but not me. Larry is an old friend. Larry and I go back to the 1980s. I've known him for a very long time, and it's fantastic to have him here. Nobody digs deeper and gets more interesting tidbits out of what's going on in Myanmar than Larry. He's really worth listening to. We brought Tony Davison too. I mean, Tony has fantastic military contacts and a great sense of what actually lies behind these conspiracies, and we're hoping that we'll let him go last when he hears everybody else. We're hoping that he'll have some very pithy pearls of wisdom. He's sometimes set this room alight with some of his theories in the past, so he's worth having here. And last but not least, we brought in Harry Myo Lin. He's the director of the Seagull, which is a human rights group, an NGO in Mandalay, representing Muslim youth. So we're hoping he's up on Skype now. I don't know if Tam has brought him up. But I'll bring him in a little bit later once we've started. But I'm going to ask Larry first, who is undoubtedly the expert here, just to outline, Larry, if you could, your own thoughts about the death of Ko Ni.
Thank you. I have to say that I have terrible misgivings sitting here to talking about Ko Ni. He was a very close friend, someone who I've spent a lot of time with, someone who we talked about his personal position, that is his security. There's no question for me. He was probably one of the most important people in the opposition movement, the opposition to the Constitution. He was obviously an incredible legal mind. He always said, "Please don't describe me as Aung San Suu Kyi's legal advisor," but in fact he was. He was also advisor to the National League for Democracy on constitutional reform. Over 12 months ago, when I spoke to military sources of mine, they told me Ko Ni is the greatest enemy of this country. He is someone we fear, not because he was a Muslim, but of course that colored their view, but because he was the one who was strongly pushing for constitutional change. Within the NLD, there were those who were softliners. Let's move quietly. Let's bring the military on board. Let's discuss when constitutional change should come. He, from the November elections on, said now is the time for us to push for constitutional change. He even said we should disregard the Constitution completely, throw it out, start again. He was working on ways in which that could be done when he was assassinated. There's no doubt that the army feared, the military feared, that he would have a strong position, official position within the government, that he would be the Attorney General. And in fact, he was one of the names being put forward within the NLD hierarchy to be the Attorney General. I suggested to him in January, the military will not take kindly to you being in a high-profile position within the executive. It would be much better for you to work behind the scenes and not have an official position. You can still work on constitutional change. In October last year, he hugged me and said, "Thank you for the warning," because he felt that they would be, after the Pinlong conference in September, they were moving now within the NLD to challenge the Constitution probably sometime this year. So there's no doubt in my mind he was a courageous man who knew he was in danger, but pressed on nevertheless. I think the question then is who killed him. It's the one that we all want to find an answer to. I'll leave the quality of the investigation to others to talk about. I'm quite convinced that the current military leaders, So Win, Min Aung Hlaing, were not involved in the assassination. I don't think it was in their interests for Ko Ni to be assassinated. And obviously it was a high-profile assassination. They could have killed Ko Ni on his way home from the office. Someone could have come up in the dark alleys down in the 34th Street and just shot him. He always worked late, never got home before midnight. If they had just wanted to kill him, they could have. They wanted to make a point. They wanted to send a message, and so it was high profile. Outside the airport, it's one of the most high profile areas, other than perhaps Naypyidaw Parliament, that an assassination of this sort could take place. But I am convinced that the current military were not actively involved, at least. When I spoke to some of my sources who were in Min Aung Hlaing's office, they said to me, this was in fact on the 30th, because I was in Mandalay when he was assassinated and was told 10 minutes after and we came back from Mandalay the next day, and I spoke to some of these people, and they said, "We're just as shocked as you are." And they said, "We're not ready." Now, what they meant was not that they were not ready to assassinate him, they were not ready for the consequences of the assassination. Because I'm quite clear that the military at the moment in Myanmar have scenarios where they are getting ready to take power. They will exercise their constitutional right to take administrative power. They're not ready yet, and they had told Aung San Suu Kyi that she had 2 years. So the next 12 months are going to be quite critical. And this assassination was a destabilizing act. There's no question of that. So if it's not the military, the current military, who is it? Now we know that those who were behind the assassination, those who paid or said they would pay the shooter, were ex-military. There's no question about that. The President's office has confirmed it. Even Jo Sway, the Home Minister, has confirmed it. These are people who have close associations with former military officers who are in the USDP. There's no question that it was in their interests that Ko Ni was assassinated. It destabilized the country. If you remember the President's statement immediately after the assassination, this is a shot across our bows, this is a warning shot, there are red lines that we should not cross. One of those, the key one, was changing the constitution. That's what they wanted to destabilize. My understanding from within the NLD, they've got part of what they want. The soft line are now arguing we shouldn't press on with constitutional change. We should step back. And the hardliners, I mean, these are false. It's false terminology, but those who were keen on constitutional change have lost their real leader in Ko Ni. He was the one who was pushing. He was the one who understood the constitution better than almost anyone I know. Many an hour we sat and we went through the constitution, and he showed me different parts of the constitution that contradicted different other parts. He said, what is primary in the constitution is the parliament, and if we can use parliament, we can change the constitution. And it doesn't need to be constitutional change in the sense that you need the 25%. There were other ways of bringing about changes. And after all, he's probably, I believe, the one who actually convinced Aung San Suu Kyi to become state councillor. He was very adept at finding contradictions within the constitution and using them for democratic advantages. Of course, I've got no proof that it's former military people that are involved, other than the fact that the two key people, one they've got caught, the other they're still chasing, were former military. DSA 34 and DSA 37, I think, they graduates. One of them that has been caught was trained as a pilot here in Bangkok, and in fact has very close links with the DKBA, the ethnic breakaway from the KNU. He's a very suspicious character. The whole situation is even more complicated by the uncertainty of certain things. First of all, there is some suggestion that the shooter and the main funder of it were actually in jail at the same time with Wiratu, the Buddhist activist monk, and had become radicalized while they were in prison. Whether that was the reason they moved against Ko Ni, it's difficult to say. I suspect that the black hands behind used the personal feelings of particularly the shooter to set him up. Everything is questionable. Sources of mine who were at the airport said there were at least 5 people with the shooter. It wasn't just one person. There was at least 5. The police admitted to me that they thought there were 3 people. 2 people who had the car ready to take the shooter away. But we're not getting any of this information from the investigation directly from them. It's leaks and suspicions. There is a total misinformation campaign going on. And the worst of that was Josue when he gave the press conference recently. And I remind you to remember that Josue, for at least 5 years, was head of military intelligence. This is someone who's used to manipulating public opinion, but is someone who would have been at the apex of any investigation. So my belief is that this was a destabilizing action that was meant to destabilize the NLD government, not necessarily to immediately give pretext for a military takeover. But I remind you to remember that immediately after the elections, who was then the General Secretary of the USDP, said, and they were shocked they lost the election. He said, "We may have lost the election. Now we have to take politics into the street." I still remember that very clearly. Now, I may be misjudging what he meant, but I believe that with the assassination of Ko Ni, whoever was behind it was trying to bring politics onto the street, with the end game stopping the National League for Democracy government, particularly to prevent them from changing the constitution. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That's really quite illuminating stuff. Look, I've got Harry Myo Lin waiting very patiently in Mandalay, coming through to us on Skype. Harry, I hope you can hear us okay. Could you give us your own thoughts about the death of Ko Ni, please? Harry?
Thank you. Yeah. Thank you very much. It's a very obviously very sad incident we passed through in the Ko Ni assassination. And same time, I think it is also an alarm for us to think about how far in Burmese society we will let this assassination happen. We have had assassination of Phro Mansha before and others ethnic leaders also. I think to bring it to broader, it is also the time for Burma, our people, to think about the question that how can we manage this ultranationalism, which is forcing individuals to take part in this kind of assassination and supporting as a publicly, and how this ultranationalism is introduced to our society for many years. When I think about Ko Ni assassination, I think Ko Ni was assassinated not only because he was Muslim or because he was a strong voice against the constitutional reform, or because he stood very courageously in the face of military oppression, or because he was a skillful and strategic lawyer in contesting the 2008 constitution. I think he was murdered because he represented all of these things. So I think we can here see 3 main factors that lead to Ko Ni assassination. And I think it is somehow related to deeper and important structural problem that we are facing these days. I think this is a combination of the rising of ultranationalism, military fear of their interests being harmed by NLD changing in government structure, and the attempts to amend the 2008 constitution. Soon after U Ko Ni assassinated, I was very shocked to see on Facebook that a police officer who is stationed at the Yangon airport and a public school teacher and a high-ranking military officer posted on their Facebook that they are very happy with this assassination and they are celebrating with the assassination of U Ko Ni. We can see that it's an individual act, but I think we have to think very deeply that how come a public school teacher, a police in the Yangon airport, and a military officer can thinking same and celebrating for this assassination. I think this is much more than a plot, then it's more larger structured problem we are facing in Burma, which has been based on the constructed long time nationalism that were taught since childhood. I think if we cannot address this structural problem of teaching Burma Buddhist nationalism, there will be much more strategies coming in future. I also think that we need serious reform in building the institution like police and army to be more human rights and tolerance oriented policing. And we also need to look at educational system in longer term impact. At the same time, we also need the action to investigate the assassination of U Ko Ni. And I also think that at the same time, national leaders like Aung San Suu Kyi need to be speaking out against this intolerance and also assassination. I think as they have this big public legitimacy and support, if they speak out against this thing, there may be some impact on public and impact on the nationalist movement. At the same time, we need to work hard to continue the courageous effort to move towards the constitutional reform. And I think there are very few time left for NLD government to do something before military can take far more steps in future.
Okay, Harry, I'm just going to stop you there. Thanks very much indeed for that.
Yeah.
Phil Robertson, with your human rights hat on, but also with your knowledge of Myanmar and the way in which particularly the criminal justice and that system has evolved, what's your own thoughts about how the Burmese authorities have dealt with this?
Well, I mean, of course, the Burmese authorities have a obligation under international human rights law to thoroughly investigate this. That is their state duty to follow through on that. And it's very interesting that we now have a press conference that was attended where the Minister of Home Affairs clearly stated that after they arrest the fourth suspect, they've already arrested 3, but after they get the fourth suspect, that the investigation is over. You essentially have a truncating of the case after this sort of small, closely connected coterie of former military officers are apprehended. And you know, there's as Larry mentioned, clear suspicions that former military men in the USDP party were potentially involved. You know, the person in that case who was involved, who was suspected to be involved, was also providing support, significant financial support to the Mabata, the extremist Buddhist nationalist group, several months before the election. You know, it's important to remember what the role of the Mabata was in that election. They were very, very focused on trying to discredit Aung San Suu Kyi and the NLD. They were involved in actually coming out and saying that, you know, it would be better for people to vote for the USDP than the NLD. They were believed behind multiple sort of social media campaigns, misinformation, you know, stating Aung San Suu Kyi was supporting the Muslims, you know, pasting photos of her with a hijab on, you know, all sorts of efforts to try to use the the perceived enmity of Buddhist, Burmans, and others against Muslims, and but they're essentially without giving any clear information, stating that we've got the four people. These four people are military, but since they left the military not involved. Stating that this was a case of extreme patriotism, without it really explaining what that even means. You have an effort to sort of rush towards a final conclusion that these four people are all done. Now one of the key people here that when we look at the people who are suspected here, you have the person that they're not arresting, that they say is not involved, is U Lin Zawtun, who's a former colonel in the Tatmadaw. He's currently a member of the parliament, and there are claims that he was actually present when the first discussions took place amongst this plotters group to kill U Ko Ni. He denies that, and of course has threatened to use criminal defamation against anybody who says otherwise. But it's very interesting that he was also the personal security officer to now head of the military senior general Min Aung Hlaing. So this person has a connection right to the top. And this person is alleged to be involved also in donating $30,000 US to the Mabata 2 months before the election. So, why is this person, not a serious suspect? Why is this person basically being sort of excluded from the investigation? That basically this is not somebody who they're interested in. It appears to us to be an effort to try to contain the story on these four people, to try to accuse them of a sort of extremist views, but then also say that they're not connected with the Mabata, and proceed with the prosecution from there. Let's be clear, U Ko Ni was the technician. The NLD has no one to replace him in terms of dealing with the Constitution. And if you look at the current configuration of Burmese politics, the 2008 Constitution is central to just about everything. It's the reason Aung San Suu Kyi is not the president. It's the reason that the Ministry of Home Affairs, the Ministry of Defense, the Ministry of Border Affairs is controlled by the military. It's the reason that when you go talk to a chief minister, like I spoke to in November, and to the Karen State chief minister, she said, I can't do anything about the military seizing land from villagers. It's a military thing. We can't do anything about it. We have no control over them. It's one of the reasons that we look at the situation in Rakhine State, in northern Rakhine State, where there have been security operations against Rohingya insurgents in an area that now have displaced over 90,000 Rohingya, including 70,000 who fled the country. That we purportedly heard that the civilian side of the government ordered that there should be compliance with the law, there shouldn't be excessive use of force, etc., and were just disregarded. It's why we have the military coming out yesterday denying not only that the military committed any abuses in northern Rakhine State, but they also denied that they had anything to do with U Ko Ni's killing. You have an investigation right now that is what the military essentially will allow. And there's a great deal of dissatisfaction. Our personal view is that the military is involved, and that the military, in fact, had the reason to be involved because, in fact, they were going after the key person who would be able to come up with a new constitution or figure out how to amend the 2008 Constitution. That 2008 Constitution, of course, is a constitution by the military for the military. And if, in fact, they hadn't had that 2008 Constitution, which everybody should remember was passed through a fraudulent referendum, they would have been swept away in the NLD electoral tide in November 2015. It came right up to the high water mark there. the largest opposition party in the parliament, of course, is the military. And at the end of the day, they, I think, probably are patting themselves on the back that they prepared so well with such an incredibly undemocratic constitution. Who now is going to play a key role for the NLD or other civil society movements that want to amend the Constitution? Who knows that much about the Constitution? Point to me. Where's that person? Ko Ni was the technician. He was the key person. And, this is an assassination. It's not just us that actually believe that. We have from very good sources that when she submits her report, the special rapporteur on human rights in Myanmar is going to call for an independent investigation into the killing of Ko Ni. That also is a very clear indication that the government is failing so far to fulfill its obligation to thoroughly and credibly investigate this crime. Now, let's be clear. Who's investigating? We have the police, right? We have the Ministry of Home Affairs. Ministry of Home Affairs is run by the military. If you look at the General Administration Department, which infuses all the various different parts of the government and is actually the local staff for these state governments, they all report to the GAD. And the GAD is full of, what do you get? Retired military, or people who have left, who, of course, the military would claim are no longer military. Ask yourself, do people ever really leave the Burmese military? Once you're in the Tatmadaw, you're in the Tatmadaw. This is a system of a separate organization that is self-funding, that has no external controls, has no accountability, has its own schools, it has its own housing, it has its own systems. And it has been separate and above the civilians in Burma for, since 1962. So, to assume that the government, the military is not involved, I think, I think ultimately they are involved. The question, comes to what Larry was mentioning, is who's involved. The Burmese military is not monolithic. There are different factions, but who's involved, and why was it done?
Thanks very much, Phil. Nice to the point. Win, can you tell us a little bit about the man you knew quite well and what he was trying to do?
Thank you very much. I took the opportunity, this very high-risk situation in Burma, because the recent, last 2 days ago, even in, our Home Minister and Chief of Police's stand for press conference, very defensive from the side of attacker. We can say terrorist, the guy who terror. So but the next day, yesterday, of course, the military strongly, responded that we are not involved for Ko Ni assassination. So that's the situation. I'm the one who came from inside Burma, ran as an NGO for working for people who for the voiceless, making amending for some apartheid law, trying to achieve with this assassinated guy, our respected Ko Ni. We call Sia Ko Ni. That means very respectable guy. And I also working with the new lawmaking process to cover for hate speech, hate crimes, and discrimination against race and religion, and to enhance the situation, maintenance of harmony among the different belief. Not only religion, whatever belief, even in contradict for, issue in Burma currently, monopolized by the big groups, for example, like Theravada, majority group monopolized for minority group. Even in different thought, different idea, never can be interpreted. That's why you're suffering even in some Buddhist small group. So the big challenging in their freedom of religion or belief, Unfortunately, the key driver for constitution change in Burma, driven by the guy who, the lawyer, we can say now murder, he also one of the guy who non-Buddhist. I wanted to use to represent some people from minority, how much contributed for the country progress, development, democratic change, like that. So that situation I like very briefly talk about. The Ko Ni is not only doing for NLD, advisor of NLD, law advisor of NLD, and advisor to so-called our state councillor. I use the term so-called our state councillor because that's new terms. So not only that, but also he accomplished, committed for human rights. He's very strong voice. Until now, no one from current ruling party talk about like him for the human rights abuses of the military, human rights abuses of former regimes, former governments. Until now, I noticed the last day I met with him on 21st of January, with together, meeting with Minister for Labor and Immigration. He's strongly convinced by the law point. You make it this NVC, so-called NVC cat, now forced to, apply in Rakhine. NVC means like, National Verification Certificate. He said illegal in front of the current minister. After 82 citizenship law, of course, we are not happy, we are not left. This law, this is apartheid law. I used the term long times already. Myanmar apartheid law. 1982 citizenship law, alias I gave the name Myanmar apartheid law. That's actually after this. Why you implemented for this NVC? That's a questionable. So I mean, strongly convinced from the side of people who are suffering, who are, terrorized. He used to stand up for this. I personally worked with him since almost 6 years already, working with different layers. I first met with him in media under the dictatorship time. He is very, DVV star. I can say DVV star, mean Democratic Voice of Burma star. Always, concerning about question about law and, constitution after forced to, referendum in 2008, so-called Nagis constitution we use. Because during the Nagis period, they make it for referendum. So that's time. Many interviews I saw from the television. At that time, I was in London, I think. I was studying there. After return back, I got opportunity to work with him in some work of our organization. We are enforcing civic education from the perspective of rights of the minority. So I never use citizenship education. That's also I like to aware you all. Citizenship is very complicated usage in Burma because of apartheid law. I'm not sure I'm citizen or not sometimes. The same like others too. So means that, I started to work with him the issue of the citizenship, 1982 citizenship issue. I noticed at my office he came and he strongly discussed with the issue with some other lawyers, a lot of lawyers. We did for the good meeting in around 2011, I noticed that, before the Rakhine conflict. And then next morning, I really amazing, he very closely working with the, NLD high-ranking, lawyer, but he came personally to my office very early. He's writing some point of what are the key and relevant with current, even if we are not agreeable 2008 constitution, already against this law. He point out some point and come and give it to us. I myself really, how can I say, fear. He is very high ranking. I'm very young guy. He came early morning to my office and give it this with the envelope. So I mean, that's how humble this guy. This guy really working with very grassroots people. I can say the presentation skill of him. Sometimes I can present like him. Sometimes my presentation is never be reached out to the very grassroots community. Even this kind of constitution that's more for politicians, we already noticed. but he can aware the public to use good presentation to understand everybody, just only ordinary people, to understand how this constitution weaknesses, how suffering for country. That's his key strength. That's why NLD took this opportunity to use all of Obama, the whole campaign for 2015, I noticed, including many chief ministers now taking as the power through his campaign. That I noticed, I monitor a lot of his speeches during the campaign period of NLD in 2015, before the 2015 election, I mean. So it means he's not only working for this issue of constitution, but he also consider for a lot of apartheid law, apartheid policy, discriminatory law, he willing to amend. That's he working with not only with NLD, but also working with international experts, like different university. I noticed he talk about he's working with very closely with Australian University of New South Wales University, and Singapore University, and some university in America, Australia, and many universities working with him for the issue of constitutional law and reform. The same, not only in flying with different international group working with this issue, he also working with the local civil society organization like us. You can see that guy during the assassination, after 1 week, you can see in more than 200 civil society issued a statement that I think one of the person who supported by more than 200 civil society are endorsed in his, condolences. Not only counted myself, by myself, this is a group. Many other group individually do a lot of statement, locally and internationally. But I noticed, and so we are working with them for, that means he working with many civil society group, particular for the rules of law. Our state councillor talk about long time or almost rules of law. Never closely working with civil society, I noticed. Because if you talk about the rules of law and grassroots education for, that kind of the law awareness, civil society a key role. They never thought to work with that. But even those, Ko Ni is personally working with many groups. So we are working with him for interfaith advocacy issue. Countrywide, we are doing forum for public advocacy. He was always speaker for our event, our forum. The last one I noticed with him, me and him, together in Lasho in October. I would like to highlight one point. I don't know why not we cannot prevent his assassination. A lot of intelligence are following behind him. At the day I was in Lasho, he came, I got a phone from my coordinator. He said, one of the intelligent guy knocked my door in 6 a.m. early morning. Because Ko Ni already arrived in Rangoon airport to fly into Lasho. They noticed he's flying to Lasho. He directly called to their regional intelligence. Hey, Ko Ni will come into your city. So the guy who one forum here, that guy are organizing, he just knocked. Are you invited, Ko Ni? He said, no, I didn't know that. I will bring to Komyowin. So he brought to me. So I mean that so in his presentation day, full of circle, I think 10 to 15 people can sit. That all intelligence are sitting in his presentation in our event. So means following always, a lot of intelligence are following behind him. Why they are not in the day of assassination? That question.
Myowen, I'm just going to have to stop you for a moment. I'm just concerned that we don't get enough time for questions. If you just, as people will ask you questions afterwards, I'd just like to ask Tony Davis if you could just reflect on everything you've heard and bring your own wisdom to bear on what you think about this assassination, which is what most people think it is.
Okay. I don't know about wisdom, but what I will say is this. That first of all, I was a little apprehensive about coming here because my sense was this was an event which actually, there wasn't an awful lot to say about it. And I think the important things there are to say about it have already been very articulately said. But what struck me immediately was the manner in which one bullet and one death of one man seemed in an amazing way to encapsulate, to symbolize two alternate futures for a whole country. And this struck me as, from the word go, as actually pretty remarkable. I was going to say initially that, well, let me say I was glad to hear that what's already come out has made two things very clear, and it's worth very quickly underscoring them. One, his death was nothing to do with the fact that he was a Muslim. It was everything to do with the fact that he was a constitutional lawyer. And I think if you take one thing away from this evening, it should be exactly that. That's already been made clear. Ultimately, what has also come out from what the speakers have said so far is that whoever gave the order, this served the interests of the military, no question about that whatsoever. I would, however, risk crossing swords with Larry on a couple of points. And Larry, as you've heard, is somebody who lives in Myanmar, and I don't. I live in Bangkok and visit from time to time. However, my sense from what I know about the Tatmadaw, from what I've studied of the Tatmadaw, and what I've seen of the Tatmadaw, is that an operation like this, with everything that we know about it in terms of the intelligence factor, which our friend here noted, in terms of the organization, in terms of preparation for a guy who's coming back from abroad, all of this, to me, says an order from the top. Now, whether that means the top man or somebody relatively close to him is up for grabs, and we're never going to know. But in my assessment, we're talking about an order from the top. And it may well have been one of those situations, was it Henry II and Thomas à Becket, or Henry I? I can't remember, but who will rid me of this turbulent priest, right? In other words, nothing's ever written, nothing's ever said in one sentence, go do it. There's a nudge, there's a wink, the top says it's good. So I think that's a factor. I also noted with great interest Larry's point about destabilization, which was a word I think used on day 2 by the president, if I'm correct. What struck me is what we saw with this remarkable assassination in broad daylight at the country's biggest international airport was not destabilization that resulted from it, but exactly the opposite. Burma was not destabilized, it was stunned. Stunned. And the state councillor, Aung San Suu Kyi's silence, remarkable silence for days and weeks, extending to not even sending a message to the family of somebody who was a close advisor, is pretty remarkable. And I think that speaks to what I'm saying here. Not just Aung San Suu Kyi, but the country as a whole was not destabilized, it was stunned. One thing which I think is important to stress, and it's something which Phil has already touched on, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it, but I think it's really important to understand this. We're talking about the Constitution and changes to the Constitution, and what we need to realize here is the amount of time and effort that went into creating this Constitution by the military, for the military, as Phil correctly put it, and where that time and effort came from. And we're talking here about a military which, from its inception, even before 1948, before independence, we're talking about a military which has been in a bunker. the military has a bunker mentality, and a bunker mentality very easily leads into a mentality of paranoia. And I think this is something we need to understand about the Tatmadaw. The Tatmadaw, some of its first operations as an independent Burmese military were not taking place in the far-flung hills of Shan State or Kachin State or Rakhine State or anywhere else. They were at the gates of Rangoon, at Insein, as Karen insurgents pressed on the city. And basically, you can look at the history of the Tatmadaw from that time through until today and into the coming years as a military focused, obsessively focused on uniting a country. This is a military for which unity is an abiding watchword every day, every minute. And you can walk around cities in Burma and you'll see signs that the military will never betray the three national causes. And the three national causes are, in their amazing English, non-disintegration of the Union, non-disintegration of unity, national unity, and preservation of sovereignty. And you can sum that up in two words, national unity. And this is what this military is all about. The 2008 Constitution, as Phil has already mentioned, this basically came out of a process which began with the fall of Kin Yunt in 2004. And from that time on, until the fraudulent, through the National Convention, which took years, up until the fraudulent referendum in 2008, putting together this constitution was one of the military's primary objectives, in addition to fighting a whole range of insurgents. But the constitution was what it was all about. And you put that history together with the threat that, as the other four speakers have all underscored, a threat that was personalized effectively in one man who could not be replaced. And then the logic of this is implacable. This man posed an existential threat, not just to their bank accounts, their future, but to the future of the country as they and their fallen comrades and their fathers, etc., have seen it since independence. And I think it's really important when we talk about the military doing this, coming from the top of the military or people close to the military. I think that we need to understand the nature of what they see from their bunker mentality, from with the paranoia that doubtless infuses their thinking, the threat that they perceive. So I think that's important to take away. I'd also like to make a couple of sort of quick references to the Constitution in the context of where Burma is headed. And I think everybody here will be aware of the fact that even before the 2015 election, but especially during and after the election, there has been a sort of facile, childlike Western enthusiasm that democratic change is coming to Burma. Transformation is a word that's thrown around a lot. That somehow Burma is back on the right track and it's all going to be good. And basically, if you set that vision against where the military has come from and is today, it disappears in a puff of smoke. And I think we need to understand that the military vision, the military have bought into democracy because they had to. There was no choice in the day and age we live in. But what they've stressed from the beginning quite openly, there's no secret here, there's nothing covert. This is a disciplined democracy, which could also be termed a praetorian democracy or a guided democracy. It's their democracy, and they're going to be running it. So any question of constitutional reform, let alone scrapping the constitution and, quote, starting again, unquote, that is going to happen when they're good and ready. And that could take another 20 years, because they're not going to be good and ready. And Min Aung Hlaing himself has already made this quite clear, again, openly, that when they have the ethnic dilemma sorted, in other words, when the Kachin are disarmed, the Ta'ang are disarmed, and bite this one, when the Wa are disarmed, right? At that point, well, we can talk about reforming the constitution. But until then, it's not going to happen. So that's the reality that we need to be looking at and understanding and moving on. So finally, you know, where does Burma go from this juncture? And really, I guess what I've implied in these remarks is it's all looking pretty bleak. The military is a supertanker. They will launch offensive against insurgents, assassinate constitutional lawyers. They will do what it takes, when it takes, to move forward their vision of how this country should be run. So at this point, where does that leave the lady? Now, I thought from the beginning, and other speakers may have different take on this, I thought her silence was catastrophic, it was disastrous, right? She should have come out and said something, given some fuel, some ammunition. It didn't have to be a full attack on the military, implying that the military was responsible. It didn't have to go that far. Indeed, arguably, it should not have gone that far. But what it should have done is to say, there is another side in this debate, and it has a voice, and that's my voice. And we're not talking about changing the citizenship law. We're not talking about the issue of Muslims and Islam. We're talking about the future of, if you like, in its core, Burman Burma. And she said nothing. And the situation today, I mean, as Larry's pointed out, the NLD has lost, if you like, the one voice, the main voice for, not just for constitutional reform or change, but the man who actually, the technician, the guy who could have done it, he's gone. So she's left. And I think the reality that we need to be looking at in the coming months and years, and again, I differ with Larry here, for me, the most important thing in the present configuration of politics in Burma is the way in which Aung San Suu Kyi and the NLD government is critical to the military. They've spent years putting her in place. It would have been nice if the USDP had won a sweeping victory in 2015, but that wasn't going to happen. She's in place. She's powerless. She is internationally and domestically a perfect fig leaf behind which we know exactly what's there. So the idea of the military destabilizing the government and then snatching power, that to me really does not add up. What I see is a scenario over the coming years in which she will be kept in place because she's democratically elected. She will be powerless. Things are not going to go particularly well on a whole range of fronts. And at the end of the day, she's going to have to face an election at the age of 75 or 76 or whatever it is. And we could well be looking at a scenario in which the NLD loses an election to the USDP. The guys with the connections, the guys who can make the electricity run and the trains go on time. That's a scenario which we need to be looking at. So I'm totally, I differ strongly with Larry in his assessment that the military has an interest in taking this government down. Bringing it down means what are they going to put up in its place? USDP is certainly not ready. Going back to military rule, equally, it's taken them 10 years to get where they are with a democratically elected fig leaf. Why blow it all away? Makes no sense. So, yeah, in conclusion, my sort of vision of the coming months and years in Burma, it is not a particularly optimistic one in terms of either constitutional reform or flourishing democracy. I think pretty much what we have today is what we're going to be stuck with for quite a while. And the only thing that could actually change that would be what is happening on the ethnic military front. But that's a whole different conversation for another time, another place. So thank you.
Thanks very much indeed. And just before we go to the microphone and questions, and that you see there's a microphone back there, I do urge you to think of some questions to take advantage of this panel. I'd like just quickly to thank Jeannie Hallisey, who's an old board member. She's not on the board now, but she organised this panel. She's ill tonight and can't show up. I'm also sorry she's not here because, as you will see, there are 6 men aligned along here. We do try to get more women on our, and we've been accused of putting manels up there, and tonight we are absolutely guilty as charged. So, Jeannie, for that...
We're not all white guys.
Well, true. We've managed to beat that one, but anyway, she's missed for that reason too. But listen, there's the microphone over there. Please take advantage, far away. And identify yourselves too, please.
Hello, I'd like to identify myself as Jeffrey Goddard, and I have a question for Larry. In your conversations with Ko Ni, did he ever express disappointment the NLD did not nominate any Muslim candidates for the 2015 election? And did he ever express disappointment there are no Muslims on the NLD Central Executive Committee?
Interesting.
I think Coney was a realist, and in terms of the candidates, he was part of a delegation that went to see her after the announcement that they weren't going to have any Muslim candidates. He accepted her position that it was too delicate and they didn't want to take Mabata on directly. The CEC, I never spoke to him about the CEC, but I mean, with the NLD power structure, I mean, he had incredible influence without being on the CEC. In fact, I would say he was more important than most of the members of the CEC.
Larry, can you explain what the CEC is to those who won't know? Yeah.
Oh, sorry. The Central Executive Committee of the National League for Democracy, which was also a hand-picked group by Aung San Suu Kyi. I think Coney was someone who was much more practical. What he wanted to see was results. He was someone who was committed to national reconciliation. And what I failed to talk about, which Myo Win did, was his concern about citizenship laws. And he was working with an Australian constitutional lawyer at trying to come up with a new approach, new in the sense that it had only been done in East Timor. And he was going to have two or 3 days of discussions on that the day after he was assassinated. I don't think Coney was someone who was disappointed with the National League for Democracy. And I can't, and perhaps I shouldn't speak for him, but my impression is he saw them as the main democratic force in the country, and the one that he had to work with. But he was prepared to work with others, as Myo Win said. He was someone which Sue wasn't prepared to do, work with civil society. He is someone who worked with the ethnic groups. He is someone who was just as important to the 88 generation. And I think it's that legacy that's more important as to whether he criticised the NLD. We all know in Myanmar it's very difficult to criticise the NLD. I've done it, and as a result, I've been ostracised.
Perhaps Harry in Mandalay, could you give us your own view on the NLD and the way in which it's dealt with for the Muslim community, particularly with that point that was raised about the absence of Muslim candidates in the last election? I'm not sure we still have Harry with us or not. We've got his face up there, but
Maybe internet connection.
Harry, did you hear that question? Okay, look, let's move on. Can we get the next question, please?
Chris Bruton, a member of the club. A couple of questions. The first thing was, Tony Davis said that Aung San Suu Kyi was supposed to be so stunned by the assassination that she said nothing for weeks. She hasn't been stunned by other things, particularly, that I've noticed. I'm not quite convinced about this explanation for her silence, and I wonder whether the members of the panel could give some greater elucidation on that. The second one, basically, if there's, in the present situation of Myanmar, which seems to be deteriorating fairly rapidly, from what I understand within the country as well as tonight, it doesn't seem as if any kind of Panglong, shall we call it, situation or solution will be found. And yet, without it, it doesn't seem there will ever be really a solution for Myanmar. So where is the solution?
Big questions. Who wants to go first?
Let me just say one thing about Chris's second question. Panglong and the famous National Ceasefire Accord, if they're not dead on their feet, they're dying by the day, and probably good riddance. I don't know, Chris, whether you're aware of the fact that last week a very different message came out of the Wa capital on the Chinese border in Pangsang, which basically said, forget about the NCA, we need to start again, we need to have a new process. And that new process, we would like the Chinese to be a part of that, and we would like the United Nations to be a part of that. And most importantly, at the end, there was quite a lot of talk about one belt, one road. In other words, China's grand vision of economic connectivity to the Indian Ocean region and East Africa and Europe beyond. So basically, we have a situation where the Wa are talking about peace in a very different context, and of course, the Wa have an army so well trained and so well equipped that the Tatmadaw will not contemplate attacking it. So that's, in terms of the future of Burma and peace in Burma, forget about Panglong, watch Pangsang. That would be my answer to that particular question.
I mean, the thing about Panlong is it's a misnomer. Panlong in 1947 was not about federalism, it was about confederation. And the KNU often say to me, don't mention 21st century Panlong or Pinlong. That was why we went to the jungles, because we understood that the military and General Aung San were not offering us federalism. I do not believe that Pinlong actually is the answer. What is needed is some form of national reconciliation, and I believe the Wa in their more pro-Chinese position are probably right with the KIO support. We need a new plan. We need a new peace plan. The NCA per se is not the answer. They're not saying we don't want peace. What they're saying is that the current process of signing the NCA and then being allowed to take part in this conference is not going to lead anywhere. What we need is national reconciliation. And before we have that, the Tatmadaw have to stop bombing us. They have to stop fighting in Shan State. They have to stop forcing refugees out of Kachin areas. I disagree a little bit with Tony, as you're getting used to, in that I think the Chinese are ambivalent. I do not think that the Chinese are completely behind the Wa position. There has been lots of discussions between the Chinese envoy, and last week in Kunming we had the Chinese dialogue, the annual dialogue between the Defense Ministry and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of both countries discussing what should happen. The Chinese, I think, are looking to see how best their interests will be preserved, and perhaps the Wa are a puppet or a conduit for that. But I also think that they want to support the government as well. I think they're ambivalent. They want to support the military and the government, but at the same time they want to support their own ethnic groups. And after all, the AA has just opened a liaison office in Kunming, so they're sending mixed messages. I agree, and I've written this for 40 years, the only way Myanmar will have peace and stability and development is if they resolve the ethnic issue. I do not believe Pinlong is a way to resolve that issue. I think some other mechanism needs to be formulated. I'm pessimistic about whether that will happen. When I talk to some of these ethnic leaders, and I say, how long before we have a federal state? How long before we have peace in the country? And they say, at least another 50 years.
I think that it's important to look at this issue from the point of view of the sort of relationship between Aung San Suu Kyi and the military and the civilian government in the military. When you look at Pinlong, essentially she's made this her big initiative. But by adopting a position where everybody has to sign, the national ceasefire agreement before they can participate, she's essentially bound herself to the sort of military's terms of engagement with this process. And as a result, the military is they can play the hard role, they can be the hard guys. They let her go through this whole initiative, and if she fails at the end, it just diminishes her further. I think, what you're looking at here, and we're seeing the same thing, her silence on the situation in Rakhine State, and the clearance operations against the Rohingya in the northern Rakhine State, where people are beating her up for being silent, when in fact, she doesn't really have a lot of control over the military, and the military and the police are the ones who are doing this. But they're more than happy to have her as the international flak catcher, and the dialogue now within the diplomats in the Rangoon bubble is essentially like, oh, we can't pressure the government too hard on what's happening in Kachin State or Rakhine State because it might weaken Aung San Suu Kyi. She's already been weakened. I mean, in fact, the whole argument for pursuing a commission of inquiry on what has happened in Rakhine State is, Aung San Suu Kyi and the NLD didn't do it. 2012, they weren't in power. And, last year from October 9th going forward, they were not, on the ground. She hasn't visited. She hasn't gone there. I mean, it's been the military and the police who've been involved. So, if you look at accountability for abuses, who is going to be held accountable based on what we know? It's the military and the police. So why is she silent? I mean, I think, this is the sort of, we're almost in sort of like tea leaf reading, like Aung San Suu Kyi, what is she doing? What's her daily schedule? Who does she see? Who does she get briefed by? We don't know. She certainly won't meet with us. I mean, she blames us for, showing satellite photos of the fact that like 1,500 structures were being burned in northern Rakhine State. Well, I'm sorry, that's our job. I mean, the truth hurts sometimes. But, what are we going to say about her being silent with, her trusted advisor being killed? I mean, stunned. Okay, well, we can be stunned for a day or two. You can be lost for words for a period of time. But, I mean, it's ungracious to go weeks without talking to the family. It's being a bad politician. It's being imperious. What are we talking about here? We're talking about someone who's supposed to lead, but at the end of the day, when it comes to making basic political decisions, doesn't seem to be able to work out a strategy. Let's actually do the sort of do the common touch that we expected. That was the common touch on my computer.
Wait for the bang.
In any case, the point is that for whatever reason, she is making the job of the military much easier. She is basically serving as a foil for international criticism, while at the same time Thank you very much. While at the same time not voicing an alternative opinion which would make it clear to the international community that in fact she is not on board with what the military is doing in these various different places. The last point I would make is that, you know, prior to the transition, if you were talking to the KNU, you were talking to the Karen, you were talking to the Shan, they were all basically like, yeah, she's a Burman, but, you know, it looks like she's someone we can talk to, someone we can work with. And I think you would be very challenged to find anybody who's still saying that now. I mean, from the ethnic point of view, she's seen as part of the problem, not part of the solution.
I think for the solution, if we talk about the solution, actually number one, that current bid era for this constitution, that is not people will. People never be involved for this constitution, you know, making process. This is only done by the military, former military or current military, I don't know, but military. But that's number two is like a solution is even our so-called national icons, she should stand up for the justice. And she should be talk about some point for injustice in this country, including Rakhine issue, including minority issue, including people who didn't get any stand for justice. She talk about too much about the rules of law, but never happened. Her legal advisor was assassinated. She didn't say anything. Until now, she just spoke last week, I think, event of memorial event, but she didn't say we should find out for justice. I will find out for justice. I will encourage for to get the solution. She didn't say. She honored a lot of very good work, very good honor to the Ko Ni, but doesn't say as an executive to take some responsible usage. So that we amazing. She speak very flowering speech, but we don't want to listen only flowering. We want to responsible speech. What her responsibility? She didn't say to find out for justice for this assassination. Who is behind? I'm sure she's not affordable to do this, but even though she is above the president, why not she stand up for justice? So that's kind of solution if she stand. That people maybe, follow her way. She was our model leader. I'm not sure now, but previously she was our model leader. Now she's real politician. I'm not sure misinterpretation of politician, I can say like that perspective. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next question, please, George.
George McLeod. I think the panel has presented a pretty compelling case of how the military was probably involved in this assassination. Larry, in particular, you seem to be broadening the scope of this, though, to paint a picture of a sort of a military conspiracy to retake power and turn the clock back to the SPDC days. I'm putting words in your mouth, but you seem to be broadening it to that point. My question is, why would the military essentially be destabilizing a process that they themselves initiated and announced in the early 90s?
Because the process had nothing to do with being a process. It was one of keeping power. And the military wanted to keep power in one way or another. What has happened since 2015 has been divisions within what we call the military. And I believe the current soldiers and their leadership do not always see eye to eye with the previous military, who were the ones who designed the Constitution. Just one point that I would like to make in response to Tony. I accept the process it will not be direct orders. I do not believe direct orders will be given. There will be discussions, there will be meetings, and we know that these guys were meeting at Than Luin, at a hotel in Than Luin several times in October. This is not something that just happened in January. It's been planned for quite some time. But my sources, and maybe I'm wrong to believe my sources, they were saying that the current army chief and deputy chief were not involved. That isn't to say there wasn't a military conspiracy. Now, the old military are part of the political hierarchy. This is the USDP that got beaten, and they didn't like it. They don't like it. And they're coming up with scenarios as to how they can regain power. Not that this is a process that we endorsed and it's going the way that we didn't predict, so we have to accept it. They don't accept it. They want power back if they believe the country goes far enough off the rails to justify action. And I believe that they have a number of different scenarios. I mean, one is let the government rule until 220. Let's depreciate the value of and credibility of the government by what's happening in the ethnic areas, what's happening in Rakhine,
what's happening in Rangoon,
and in the economy. I mean, they're not, they're preserving the economic power of the UMHEL and MEC, the two military economic institutions. They are quite happy to reduce her credibility, and they believe, I don't believe, that the USDP will win in 220, but it will be a very different election in 220. The USDP will not be decimated in the same way it was, and I think this is where the ethnic parties, and I have to tell you now, my predictions for the 2015 election were totally wrong, but they were based on the belief that the ethnic parties would actually be the most important group of opposition or policy makers in Parliament. People in the ethnic areas chose to vote NLD because, as Sue said, if you vote for an ethnic MP, you will get a very good MP, but if you vote for the NLD, you will get a very good government. And they believed it. The ethnic groups or the ethnic areas will not do that. But Min Aung Hlaing definitely believes he is going to be a candidate for the 220 elections. That is one scenario. The other scenario is if things, and I'm not talking about immediately, at least a year. They've actually, Min Aung Hlaing told Dorsu in March, we give you 2 years. Don't touch the constitution, we give you 2 years. So they're not looking to take power in any way until at least after April next year. But it'll only be if they feel they need to. Apart from they're still running the country in terms of the GAD, the local administrations, the three key ministries, Defence, Border Affairs and Home. They're having quite a good time. They're not under any threat. But if there is increased social unrest, and if I was a conspiracist, which I'm not.
Can I add one point regarding with this question?
Just let Larry finish, then we'll get to one moment. Yeah.
If I was a conspiracist, I'd say that this was a balloon, the shooting of Ko Ni, to see whether people will come out onto the streets, to see if there would be social unrest. There wasn't. So they've had to shelve their objectives. I still think that the military thinks that the interests of the military, and the point where I do agree with Tony is that they are in a bunker. They are paranoid, and they honestly believe that they're the only ones who can rule the country.
Nguyen, please.
Just one point, just regarding related with this question, that U Ko Ni was shared one point in 2016 September. I noticed the day when I was in his home. He said, before you going, somebody came to me. He was very close with military. He said to me, you are the second biggest enemy of military. Military said. U Ko Ni himself shared to me. at that day that I like to point. One point. Somebody said to him, Ko Ni is the second biggest enemy of military. He himself said to me. So I'm not I don't want to say he shared first one who, but I don't want to share the name. Thank you.
But we can guess the name.
Yeah.
And it's not the lady, it's Shui Man.
Yeah.
Yeah. But I mean, I think the issue is this. Right now, I would agree that the Burma Army is having a very good ride. And actually, having dealt with the state governments of Rakhine State and the state government of Karen State, you know, the NLD put their chief minister in these places, but you know, these are still being run by the GAD. You know, and you run into the state secretaries; they're former military. They speak English. They basically have a lot of experience in knowing what's going on in the state. You know, she has put in these chief ministers who are completely unsupported within the administration that they're supposed to be overseeing. You know, they're given a lot of honor, of course, chief minister, whatever you say, and then basically everybody goes to the state secretary and says, what are we really doing now? I mean, and you know, the state secretary, when we were talking about issues in Karen State and land problems, he said, well, you know, the problem with some of these villagers is they don't have a proper understanding of discipline, democracy awareness is his term. And you know, this is what they believe. And you know, so when you talk about you know, the military taking over, what you're talking about is causing a sort of earthquake in issues related to foreign direct investment and issues related to engagement with the external world. I mean, what Aung San Suu Kyi did by basically giving the sign-off and saying, okay, you can lift the sanctions, is she basically opened up Burma for business. And while the investment is going in slower than people thought, you know, during the early gold rush days, it is going in, and it will continue to go in. And, you know, the military wants that. They want to benefit from this. I mean, as Larry put it, you know, the UMEH, UPINE, and the MEC, these military conglomerates, snap up a piece of anything that's profitable. You know, so you have a state within a state, and I don't see the state going to the point of actually removing the civilian government, because at this point, the civilian government is working just fine for them. It's largely a powerless figurehead. You know, this is why we have said repeatedly to the NLD, use the power you have in the parliament, and start getting rid of some of these repressive laws and things that are continually used by these various different GAD officers to arrest civil society, to arrest protesters, you know, to use defamation laws and other laws against ordinary people. That, you know, ultimately, the real ally of the NLD and Aung San Suu Kyi is civil society, and their real source of power is the support of the people. But they're not using that. You know, they're trying to sort of negotiate some sort of inside deal with the military, and guess what? It's not working. You know, so you know, I only see a takeover at a point where there is some confrontation. And at this point, I just don't see the NLD as prepared to do that, because they, for whatever reason, are not organized enough. They're not prepared to sort of move beyond this, and they think somehow that perhaps the military is thinking in the interest of the country rather than the interest of themselves.
Right, we've reached that time of night. Can we ask a question, please? Make sure it is a question, not a statement.
Before question, my name is Mongjono. I'm a Rohingya, also a student activist. I came here before question, only one sentence, sir. Because the present student generation, those who were in prison before, they pushed me to come here when they know this occasion. And Rohingyas inside Myanmar, especially my area, northern Arkan, and also from Bangladesh, they pushed me to attend this occasion because Ko Ni was uncontroversial national leader for the Rohingyas, because we have the hope on him. as well as students, those who are working against, the government, military government, who don't like the, the government system present, including Aung San Suu Kyi. Nowadays, Aung San Suu Kyi. These two groups pushed me to come here. I'm sick also. My health is not very good. So my question here is first to the P. Robertson. How do you weigh former two gentlemen, Kunsum Shai, a lawyer from Thailand, and another Kunsumba from Laos, who have been missing from the roadside. We didn't know where is their dead body, where they are, whether they are alive or not. But first, U Kuni's family, also a bit close with me too, as a Muslim, or I don't see him only the Muslim, he's a leader for all the communities. At least his family members and all the democratic loving people of the Burma, they got his dead body. They saw his dead body. The funeral times, most of the people, largest people, they attended there, except Aung San Suu Kyi, except the best friend of U Kuni as well as Kun Larry, your friend of Aung San Suu Kyi and
can we get to the question, please?
Yeah. How do you think that? Can we get the justice under this so-called Nargis Constitution of 2008? 2008, isn't it? You mean 2008? Because we combinedly, unitedly believe that due to this 2008, he was assassinated. Do you believe that under this constitution, without driving up this constitution, do you believe that we get the justice from him, about him, as well as the mass killing of Rohingya people, especially after 9 October, around 1,000, and other ethnic people killing around the world, in Burma? Do you believe that?
It sounds like a rhetorical question.
Under this constitution?
Do you want
that
the
is my question. Thank you very much.
Okay, fine. We'll see what the panel thinks.
Okay, thank you. There are two questions there. One question was related to the case of Somchai Nilapajit of Thailand and Sombat Sompon of Laos, both who've been enforced disappearances by those governments, and comparing them. And I would say, to be honest, the crime of enforced disappearance, where a family doesn't know what's happened to an individual, is perhaps one of the cruelest human rights crimes you can imagine. I've sat here on this stage with Aung San Suu Kyi, who's a National Human Rights Commissioner of Thailand, and Shui Meng, who's the wife of Sombat Sompon. And it's very difficult. To be honest, I think both of them, certainly Aung San and I think Shui Meng as well, realize that their husbands are probably dead, but they may never find out what happened to them. And it's a sort of hole in their life and their soul that they don't know how to fill. As horrible as the assassination of U Kuni was, being shot down while holding his grandson. People saw that photo. I just was appalled. What is that kid gonna grow up with? Your grandfather was killed while he was holding you. Who's gonna tell him that? Is he old enough to remember? But at least there's a degree of closure. Now, on the issue of justice under the 2008 Constitution, the problem is that the 2008 Constitution sets out the military as a separate actor. The civilian government doesn't have any effective control over the civilian government. There's no real civilian oversight over the Tatmadaw. They don't have any control really over the budget. There's a council, the National Security and Defense Council, which is basically a coup mechanism embedded in the Constitution that they could enact at any time. And the most important ministries are controlled by the military. So this is essentially a constitution to entrench military impunity. That's what it is. So when you talk about justice for crimes committed by the military, no. You know, I mean, and this is what we're going to see, you know, unless there's an international investigation, an independent international investigation, a commission of inquiry into Rakhine State, we're going to see the same thing we saw in 2012, which was basically horrible crimes for which no one is held accountable. You know, the same thing is happening in Kachin State and Northern Shan State. And if we you know, roll back a number of years to 2010 and before, it was happening in Karen State, it was happening in Karenni State, because the Tatmadaw as a organization, as a military, has not changed one iota the way they operate on the ground when they're dealing in conflict areas. I mean, what we saw in northern Rakhine State was basically what the Karen people, the Karenni people, the Shan people, the Mon people have seen previously in earlier days, in earlier years. So, you know, you're dealing with a military that has not moved to accommodate, you know, a change of governance in Burma at all. You know, the Constitution is the same, but, you know, it's a democracy, yes, but the military is still there, and they're still doing the same thing that they were doing previously, except now they have a Nobel Peace Prize winner as a hood ornament.
Thanks very much. You got a question? I'll make this the last question, if that's okay, thanks.
Okay, Paul Greening. Just a question to the panel about the response and their comments on the response of the international community, including the UN, outside and within the country, and also what should the response of the international community be now? Thanks.
Let me say something on that. The problem the international community has as let's just say a Western diplomat put it to me the other day, is beyond Aung San Suu Kyi and the NLD, there is no plan B. So they're basically tied to the NLD government. So the question is, what is the NLD government going to do? Now, it's sort of been alluded to, I think, without being actually underscored, that given the constitutional reform or constitutional changes off the table, very clearly, right, unless you want to die, and given that the Tatmadaw have a lock grip over the governance of the country, the only real asset that Aung San Suu Kyi has, both internationally, still disappearing by the day, but it's still there, but more importantly in Burman, ethnic Burman Burma, is street power. Now, the tragedy, in my opinion, of Burma today is that she is not of the age or the mentality to use street power, and certainly Western governments, the quote international community, is not going to be whispering those sort of messages in her ear. Now look at a scenario where she could get 500,000 people on the streets of Rangoon. Now, what I think we all know is that scenario would not be 1988 revisited. You wouldn't see Tatmadaw gunning down 5,000 people. That wouldn't happen. God knows what would happen, but that wouldn't happen. So unless the NLD and Aung San Suu Kyi is prepared to go down that road, which they're not, you're stuck with what you got. And the Western community is going to stand right behind that, because the Western community, what are their interests in Burma? Two things. One Phil's already alluded to, open for business, right? That's happening every day. And equally importantly, they've got geostrategic interests. And that means One Belt, One Road, China's interests, et cetera, et cetera. Now, those interests may be served as well in the future by a USDP government that's taken over from a lame duck, aging Aung San Suu Kyi, incompetent NLD government. Those interests may be served very well by the USDP in the future, democratically elected.
Thanks very much.
I mean, this is the dilemma. I think Tony has really put his finger on it. You know, this is why, you know, we have argued to them that, you know, use your power in the parliament, you know, because that's the one area where your power is still uncontested. It's you know, get rid of some of these repressive laws, you know, figure out how you're going to deal with the land issue. do these things where you have the power to do it. But organizationally, they just have not been very adept. I mean, in sort of classic sort of Burmese governance sense, she has essentially centralized power in herself and her close advisors, rather than developing and empowering teams of people to go down to like the state level and really actually support people to implement things. I mean, as I was looking at these state governments and the way they run, each of these state ministers should have a crackerjack team of like 5 to 10 NLD appointed aides who are working with them to be able to do things, to be eyes and ears, to be able to say, when we get an appeal from a villager about land being taken by a border guard force, that they go down and take a look and they can assess what the situation is, and a decision can be made without having to rely on an information stream through a pro-military GAD appointed advisor. But they're not doing that. So they're doing the ribbon cutting and they're giving the speeches, but in terms of actual impact, this is sort of like rain on a hot sidewalk. You turn around and it's dried up and gone.
Bleak stuff. Listen, I'm going to wrap it up now because we've gone on quite long for this evening. We've probably lost Harry, whose Skype connection to Mandalay failed us. His face was there, but the rest of it wasn't. So we'll have to thank him in his absence and thank all of you for a really very broad discussion. And do remember, if any of you are not members, membership is really worthwhile. The forms are in the office. It's really easy to join. Join our club.
I went across here, so it's fine. Smells like beer, though. Sorry? Smells like beer.